All came at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had just gotten up to take my blood pressure medication, something my doctor started me on after I turned 62, and my phone lit up on the kitchen counter before I even reached the cabinet. My son's name on the screen at that hour made my stomach drop the way it only does when you've been a mother long enough to know that nothing good comes from a 2 a.m. call. Mom. His voice was flat, not crying. Worse than crying. The kind of flat that means a person has already used up all their tears and what's left is just empty. She's gone. She took the kids. And I think, Mom, I think she took everything. I told him to stay where he was. I grabbed my coat off the hook by the door, didn't bother with my hair, and drove 40 minutes across town in the dark. I want to tell you that I was panicking. That would be the normal thing, wouldn't it? A 64-year-old woman alone on the highway at 3 a.m., mind racing, hands shaking on the wheel. But the truth is, I wasn't panicking at all. I was thinking, there's a difference between fear and clarity, and I learned that difference a long time ago, back when my husband left and I had a 7-year-old boy, a mortgage, and exactly $340 in a checking account. Fear would have paralyzed me then. Clarity is what got me through. So I drove, and I thought, and by the time I pulled up to my son's house, the house he had lived in for 9 years, the house where my grandchildren learned to walk, I already had a shape of what needed to happen next. He was sitting on the front porch steps, 36 years old, and he looked about 12. Jeans, a wrinkled t-shirt, barefoot on the concrete even though it was 40 degrees out. I sat down next to him and didn't say anything for a minute. Sometimes that's the only right thing to do. His wife, my daughter-in-law Serena, had left that afternoon while he was at work, packed the kids, packed her things, and was gone before he got home at 6. No note. Just a text that said, "The lawyer will be in touch. Don't call me." The lawyer was in touch, all right. A certified letter arrived by courier at 8 o'clock that evening, which told me the whole thing had been planned carefully and for some time. Inside was a petition for divorce and, attached to it, something that made my son's hands shake when he passed it to me. A quitclaim deed. Already signed, notarized, dated 3 weeks prior. His signature, or something close enough to it, transferring his share of the house to her name only. He hadn't signed it. He was certain of that. He would have remembered. I read the document twice. Then I folded it very carefully and put it in my purse. "Have you eaten anything?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Come inside. We're not going to figure anything out, sitting in the cold. I want to give you some background, because it matters for understanding what happened next and why I wasn't as helpless as Serena believed I was. I spent 31 years working in real estate law. Not as an attorney, I don't have a law degree, but as a paralegal and then as a senior title examiner for one of the largest title insurance companies in the state of Georgia. I have reviewed more deeds, more closing documents, more property transfers than most attorneys see in a career. I know what a legitimate notarization looks like. I know what chain of title is supposed to look like. I know exactly which questions to ask and exactly which offices to walk into. I retired 4 years ago. I live quietly. I drive a sensible car. I keep a small garden. I don't talk about money. Serena had known me for 11 years, and in all that time, I'm not sure she ever thought of me as anything more than a nice older woman who brought sweet potato pie at Thanksgiving and remembered the kids' birthdays without being reminded. That was fine. I had never needed her to think more of me than that. She didn't know about the property I owned. 3 rental units I'd bought one by one over 20 years. Modest places that I kept up carefully and rented to good tenants. She didn't know that I had spent 3 decades understanding exactly how real property could be stolen because my job had been to make sure it wasn't. And she absolutely didn't know that her own father-in-law, my ex-husband, a man I hadn't spoken to in 27 years, had tried something very similar once, and that I had handled it then too. In the kitchen, I made my son eat a bowl of soup I found in his refrigerator, and while he ate, I asked him careful questions. When had he last signed anything related to the house? Had Serena ever asked him to sign paperwork at home? Maybe something she said was routine, insurance-related, something he might not have looked at closely? Had her parents been visiting recently? What was the name of the notary on the document? That last question made him look up. Why does the notary matter? Just answer, honey. He found the letter. The notary's name was listed as Gerald R. Whitmore, commission number stamped in the corner, expiration date 2 years out. I wrote it down. Her parents. I should tell you about her parents because they were at the center of all of this. Her father, I will call him what my son always called him, which was just Sir, because the man never invited familiarity, was a retired contractor who had built a decent business in the 90s and never stopped believing it made him better than everyone around him. He had opinions about my son from the beginning. Subtle things at first, comments about stability, about ambition, about whether certain people had the drive to provide for a family long term. My son is a high school history teacher, a good one. Kids come back years later to tell him so. Her father never once asked about his work without a small smile that said he found it amusing, the way you'd find a child's drawing amusing. When my son and Serena bought their house, her father had offered to help with the down payment. My son refused. I had raised him to refuse. You don't take money from people like that because the money is never actually a gift. It's a leash. Serena was angry about it for months. Her father, I think, never forgave it. What I pieced together later, and it took me a few weeks to piece it together completely, was that Serena and her father had been planning the separation for at least 6 months. She had consulted an attorney, moved money from their joint account incrementally so the withdrawals wouldn't flag, and arranged with someone to produce that forged deed. The goal, as best I can understand it, was to leave my son with nothing, no house, no savings, no leverage. Just the clothes in his closet and a teaching salary, and it might have worked if she had known who his mother was. The morning after I arrived, I drove to the county recorder's office when it opened at 8:30. I brought the deed. I asked to speak with someone in the document examination division, a specific department, not the general counter, and I knew to ask for it because I had worked with county recorders for 3 decades. I explained what I suspected. I was polite and precise, and I did not use emotional language, because emotional language makes bureaucrats uncomfortable, and precise language makes them pay attention. The examiner pulled Gerald R. Whitmore's commission record. It had expired 14 months ago. A notarization performed by an expired notary is not valid in the state of Georgia. The deed was, on its face, defective. The examiner flagged it and told me I would need to have an attorney file a formal challenge, which I already knew, and I thanked her and left. I had the name of an attorney before I got back to my car, a real property litigation specialist I had worked with years ago, a woman named, well, I'll just say she was thorough, and she was not cheap, and she was exactly what my son needed. I called her from the parking lot. She remembered me. We had coffee that afternoon. Now, the thing about situations like this is that they tend to unravel faster than the people who constructed them expect once you pull the right thread. The forged deed was the right thread, but there were others. The money Serena had moved from the joint account, $23,000 over 7 months, was documented in the bank statements my son pulled at my request. In Georgia, dissipation of marital assets is taken seriously in divorce proceedings. Her attorney would know that. Her father, who fancied himself sophisticated about such things, apparently did not. The property at the center of the dispute was also, it turned out, partially secured by a home equity line of credit that my son had taken out in his name only for a roof repair 3 years ago. That meant the title situation was more complicated than Serena's team had accounted for, and any transfer of the property was going to require resolution of that lien. Her father had apparently advised her that the forged deed would simply sweep the whole thing over. He was wrong. He had built houses for 30 years and thought that made him an expert in real estate law. It did not. My son's attorney, the thorough one, filed the challenge to the deed within a week. She also filed a motion regarding the dissipated assets and a separate motion requesting that the residence not be sold or transferred pending resolution of the divorce. The judge granted the temporary order within 48 hours. I watched my son read the order when it came through. Something in his face shifted, not happiness exactly, but the return of something that had been gone since that night on the porch steps, the feeling that the ground was still under his feet. Serena's attorney called the next day and asked for a meeting. I want to be very clear about something. I did not do any of this out of dislike for my daughter-in-law. That might sound strange given what I've described, but it's true. I watched her for 11 years. I watched her love my son in the beginning, genuinely. I watched her get worn down by something, her father's voice in her ear, maybe, or her own disappointment in a life that hadn't gone the way she planned, or both. People make terrible choices when they feel trapped, and I don't think she woke up one morning simply deciding to be cruel. I think she had been talked into a plan by someone who told her it was the only way out, and she had been frightened enough and angry enough to believe him. But I also couldn't let my son lose his home because of it, and I couldn't let my grandchildren grow up watching their father be crushed without anyone fighting for him. The mediation was 3 weeks after the filing. I didn't attend, it wasn't my place, but my son called me from the parking lot after. The same parking lot where I had made that first call to the attorney, and his voice sounded entirely different from that night on the porch. The forged deed was withdrawn. Serena's attorney had apparently spent considerable time advising her that pursuing it was not going to end well. The house would be sold through a legitimate process and the proceeds divided. The dissipated funds would be factored into the settlement. My son would have equitable time with the children. It wasn't a victory exactly. Divorce never is. He still lost the life he had built, the daily presence of his kids, the version of the future he'd imagined. Those losses are real, and they don't go away because the legal outcome was fair. I won't pretend otherwise. But I remember a Tuesday afternoon, maybe 2 months after all of it was settled. My son brought the kids over, and we made dinner together, the four of us, and my youngest grandchild. She's 5, curious about everything, climbed up on the counter stool and watched me roll out biscuit dough and asked me approximately 47 questions about why biscuits have to rest before you bake them. I answered every one. My son stood at the stove stirring the soup, and he looked, for the first time in months, like himself. After dinner, after the kids were in the guest room watching a movie, he sat across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "How did you know what to do?" he asked. "That first morning, you just knew." I thought about it. About the 3 a.m. drive. About the deed on the kitchen table. About 31 years of reading documents that other people had tried to make look like something they weren't. "I've been paying attention for a long time," I said. "That's all." He nodded, like that made sense. It does, I think, when you've lived long enough to understand that the most useful things you carry aren't things anyone can see. Her father called me once, in the middle of all of it. I don't know what he expected. Maybe that I would be frightened, or deferential, or grateful for the call the way I imagine women my age are sometimes expected to be grateful when a man decides to speak to them directly. He said something about how families should handle their own matters without outside interference. He said my son needed to accept reality. I let him finish. Then I said, "I spent 31 years making sure property transfers were done correctly and legally. I know what your daughter signed, and I know what she didn't sign. I'd suggest you have a conversation with your own attorney before you call me again." He didn't call again. I'm not telling you this story because I want you to think I'm exceptional. I'm not. I'm a 64-year-old woman who likes gardening and makes decent biscuits and goes to bed at 10 o'clock most nights. I'm telling it because I've lived long enough to know that the people who underestimate quiet women have a particular kind of confidence in them, the kind that isn't based on actually knowing who they're dealing with. They look at a certain kind of woman, older, unassuming, not the kind who announces herself, and they make assumptions. Those assumptions are their vulnerability, not mine. My mother used to say, "Still water runs deep." I heard it so many times growing up that it stopped meaning anything to me for years. Now I think about it fairly often. The kids spent spring break with my son this year, all 5 days. I drove up on the last afternoon and we took them to a park near his new apartment. Smaller than the house, but his and full of his things, and clean in the way that a space is clean when someone is finally at peace in it. My grandchildren ran ahead on the path, and my son and I walked behind them in the late afternoon light, not talking much, just watching them. At some point, my granddaughter turned around and called back to us, "Grandma, can we come to your house next weekend?" I said yes before she even finished the question. Some things you don't have to think about, you just know. I keep thinking about that forged signature, about someone sitting at a table, carefully imitating my son's handwriting on a document they believed would erase 9 years of his life, his home, his stability, his ground to stand on. There's something that happens to a person when they believe they've already won. They start being careful. They stop asking questions. And that's usually exactly when things begin to fall apart for them. I don't believe in luck, not really. I believe in what you build quietly over time, and whether you've been paying attention. 31 years of reading property documents taught me something that no one can take away, that the truth of a transaction lives in its details. And details don't lie the way people do. A notary commission has an expiration date. A signature has a rhythm. A chain of title has a logic. Serena's father thought he understood how real estate worked because he had built houses. He didn't understand that building a house and understanding the legal architecture beneath it are two entirely different things. That gap between what he assumed he knew and what was actually true was what undid them. I think about that often when I think about what I want my son to carry forward from all of this. Not bitterness, not suspicion, but the understanding that knowledge is not passive. You have to earn it, tend it, keep it sharp, even when you think you'll never need it. I spent decades learning things that nobody around me thought mattered much. A quiet woman in a county recorder's office, learning the difference between a valid and defective notarization. Nobody was watching. It didn't feel significant at the time. And then one morning it was the only thing standing between my son and losing everything. That's the first thing. The second is this. The way you conduct yourself when you have power over someone else is who you actually are. When I called the attorney, I was precise. When I spoke to the document examiner, I was respectful. When Serena's father called to intimidate me, I did not raise my voice. I said what was true, and I let that be enough. I was not performing graciousness. I simply understood that cruelty is a waste of energy and that clarity is more effective than anger. Every choice I made through that process, I made as the person I want my grandchildren to see when they think of me. That matters. It has always mattered, even when no one is watching. And the third thing, the one that is hardest to hold on to when you're sitting on a porch at 3 a.m. with nothing and no idea what comes next, is that you don't have to know how it ends to take the next right step. My son didn't know that morning if he would keep his home. I didn't know either. But I knew to drive to the county recorder's office. I knew which questions to ask. And I kept moving forward one step at a time, trusting that doing the right thing carefully and persistently was going to matter. It did. My granddaughter asked me last spring if we could come back to my house the following weekend. I said yes before she finished the question. There are answers you don't have to think about because you've spent a lifetime making sure they'd be true. That's all any of us can really do.